Hello, people of Earth, and of course, hello, Jason Isaacs, wherever you are out there in your starship. Today we're going to talk about direct democracy now. I thought I'd done this ages ago, but I think what I might have done is hold off until we had some examples of it. And yeah, I think we had one quite recently. And the interesting thing is that subject to that little exercise, pretty much everything that we knew about direct democracy has been shaken up. And we're looking at it again with almost fresh eyes. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's start off by looking at what democracy is. And of course, you will know from my many, many different presentations that a democracy is a system of government predicated on popular sovereignty. Now, let's just dig into sovereignty a little bit, because we're going to chuck these terms around over the rest of this particular presentation. And it is my contention that in the UK we have three different types of sovereignty. We have got political sovereignty. This attends to the people. All political authority flows from the people. When it comes to political sovereignty, the people answer to nobody. We don't answer to God. We don't answer to the Queen. We don't answer to the sun, the moon, and the stars. Without the people, there is no politics. In the UK, the people are the political sovereigns. Everything, basically, the buck stops with us. However, we can't reasonably be expected to make our own laws. That's far, far, far too complicated. And so we have legal sovereigns who step in and do that job for us. And of course, that is Parliament. So we have legal sovereignty that resides in Parliament. Parliament can make, amend, or set aside any legislation it sees fit. And of course, that gives us what we know as a parliamentary system. No fixed constitution, rather, the constitution is what Parliament says it is at any given time. Of course, Parliament needs a bit of a steer. Parliament needs to know what it's going to do, because Parliament makes law. It doesn't really make decision. And so we need somebody to set the agenda and to make those decisions. And they have policy sovereignty. And in the UK, that is from government. Now, you'll remember that legal sovereignty is established through elections. The political sovereigns delegate their authority to the legal sovereigns through the process of elections. And of course, the legal sovereigns delegate authority to the policy sovereigns through the principle of parliamentary government. And if you don't know what that is, then you need to go back and look it up. And of course, the principle of parliamentary sovereignty means that the government is accountable to Parliament, and the principle of elections means that the legal sovereigns and Parliament are accountable to the people. So there's a nice little symmetry there in the whole process. So we're going to be chucking these terms around. Do try to bear them in mind. They make life an awful lot easier. Here's another little thing that might make things a little easier. This is from the media recently, and it's to do with the EU and Richard Dawkins getting involved. He moved off God for a change. I guess he thought he'd solved that particular issue. And instead, we're now talking about the EU and what that means for democracy. And I'll let you read that, because I think it's very, very interesting. Most things that Dawkins says, whether you agree with them or disagree with them, are interesting. You can read that. And yeah, it is, I think, pertinent to democracy in the UK. So we know that there are two different types of democracy really that work. We have direct and indirect democracy, sorry, direct and representative democracy, or indirect democracy, but representative democracy more properly. And we both start with the people. So in the representative system, as we discussed earlier, the decision is made by representatives acting on behalf of those people. We have Parliament that makes laws. We have government that tells laws we have Parliament that makes laws. We have government which tells Parliament even which laws to make. And so we have that intermediary stage there, the representatives who stand between the people and the decision. In direct democracy, that intermediate is gone. It's a simple question there that is put to the people, and they decide. So, what is it then? What is direct democracy? And this is a definition from the Marx scheme, from the old Edexcel Marx scheme, but it's as good a definition as you are going to get. And it's all to do with that idea of representation, the intermediate standing between the policy, between the people and the decision. In terms of history, we have two different models, really. We have the Athenian democracy, which is when everyone sits around and makes decisions. That is not really sustainable for all sorts of reasons. Switzerland is perhaps the closest model we've got to that. And then we've got the contemporary historical model, which is, of course, the use of things like sporadic and occasional involvement, as characterized through referendums and e-democracy, consultative democracy that you might remember from your work on pressure groups. And that's really our idea of direct democracy. Again, it's that direct, unmediated participation of citizens in the tasks of government, either occasional or ongoing. Right, so that's that bit. Direct democracy in action. Well, I mentioned e-petitions earlier, and there's a handout at the end of this presentation, or there's a slide, sorry, on the end of this presentation about that. In terms of, there's a nice little bit about it there. Other electronic direct democracy you might choose to look at. We don't really have much of those at the minute, but we do have a form of consultative democracy through policy forums and through pressure groups. And this really reached its apotheosis in the big society and big conversations that we had before we went down the Brexit road, which is a different type of direct democracy. Which brings us to recall, and of course we don't really have any meaningful form of that. And the last of all of those is referendums. Okay, so referendums and political sovereignty. What exactly does it mean? Well, these are your technical details when it comes to referendums. The government decides if there's going to be a referendum. Now here the government is exercising policy sovereignty. It decides if there's going to be a referendum, what is that referendum going to be? It sets the agenda, it makes the decisions. Referendums are described by law, and so we have legal sovereignty. If you look up the law that established the Brexit referendum, it's there on Wikipedia or anywhere else you choose to get it. If you're going to have a referendum, you need to have a law that makes that referendum legitimate. We then have the decision from the policy sovereigns, that is us, that then goes back to government and in their capacity as policy sovereign. Did I say political sovereigns there? Sorry, that's political sovereigns. So the political sovereigns make the decision. That then goes back to the government to implement that decision, and then Parliament takes that decision, and turns it into legislation. So in the case of a referendum, what we have is that the political sovereigns here are exercising policy sovereigns. The government, in its capacity as policy sovereign, says, well, actually, you know what, we can't make this decision, so we're going to refer the decision back to the people. We're going to refer this huge technical question or whatever it is that we can't decide ourselves. We're going to defer that to the political sovereigns, and they can make the decision, and they can live with the consequences. But there's all sorts of different transfers of sovereignty as we go through this. The policy sovereigns say to the legal sovereigns, give us a law that will allow the political sovereigns to make the decision. So again, the policy sovereigns ask the legal sovereigns to make the law. That law then gives policy sovereignty temporarily to the political sovereigns. That then goes back to the policy sovereigns who decide how they're going to implement it. And then that goes back to the legal sovereigns who pass the law to make this happen. And you can definitely see this as we go through the Brexit referendum in the UK. But I'm getting ahead of myself on that one. Now, referendums in the UK are described by an act of law, as I said earlier, and that is laid out in the 2000 PEPERA Act. The Electoral Commission is then charged with running these things. That's a Quango, a quasi-autonomous non-governmental organisation. Again, these referendums are created by acts of Parliament. And the Electoral Commission gets involved with that as well, but the final decision is left with government. Before we had Blair, we had only been 4 referendums in the UK. Since then, things have gone absolutely mental. The various ones that are important here, or certainly the ones you should know about, are this one, which established devolution. This one that established the London Mayor and the GLA. Here's another devolution one over here. This one is often forgotten, but it's kind of important in that it's one of those odd occasions when a referendum backfired on government. They were not expecting this answer of no, and immediately the government panicked and cancelled other referendums. Again, turnout extremely low there. That's worth bearing in mind. Here we have a very much cooked issue. This was a very, very bad referendum in that the people were offered something worse than what they already had. And then, of course, we get into this big one here, which was Scotland. in 2014. Turnout there quite significant. But of course the big one was this one. And what we're going to do is we'll just look at this, look at what this means for referendums generally. Here are your arguments in favor of referendums. It is a pure form of democracy. This is all from the textbook. I mean, what we found certainly since the UK's referendum on Brexit is that it is a very interesting form of government. Anyway, it's a direct form of democracy. It encourages political participation. It encourages political awareness. Can be used to overcome obstacles. Now, this is a very interesting one, certainly in Northern Ireland. This was used to give legitimacy to a system that a lot of people weren't convinced was legitimate. And that obviously feeds into this one as well, the idea that it can offer closure on divisive issues such as the EU. Of course, we're all in happy Brexit land, as now we understand. Anyway, arguments against referendums, that it's inconsistent with representative democracy. If you're using a referendum, then essentially it's an admission that your representative system of democracy has failed. It's also unsustainable. You can't do it again and again and again. Rarely proposed on issues where an outcome is uncertain. Again, your go-to example here was previously the regional referendums in 2004, where the government was caught napping. In this occasion, the EU referendum, well, Cameron thought he was going to win it, just as he thought he was going to win Scotland in 2014. He certainly won. Well, he narrowly scraped the Scottish result in 2014, the result he expected. Obviously, things went a little differently in 2016. And this is where the whole thing gets really, really messy. It's all about government power. Whether or not we have them is at the discretion of Parliament and government. The wording is at the discretion of Parliament and government. And these two bits here are evidence of that. That in both of these instances, the government managed the question so that it returned the answer that they wanted or that they expected. But now we get into some really, really important issues. That some issues are just too complicated, the public are perhaps too ill-informed, and then we have the issue of the tyranny of the majority, that sometimes the majority are wrong and they might choose to impose their will on a consistent and persistent minority. So those are your general arguments against referendums. In terms of, do they outweigh the advantages? Well, with pure form of democracy, yes, but it undermines the representative process. Legitimizes action, or indeed inaction, but now we know that it's almost always a loaded question. Offers closure on divisive issues. Well, no, it doesn't. And I think this is the big one. The idea that we now have closure on Scotland, or indeed on the EU, demonstrates that referendums very, very rarely bring closure to particularly divisive issue. They just kick that particular problem down the road. I'm nearly at the end of my 15 minutes. I'm going to leave this one here. This is e-petitions. The whole idea of e-petitions is that they generate a talk in the House of Commons. They don't necessarily compel action to the government. They do occasionally work. The one that really does work particularly well was the Hillsborough one, where the public debate, the debate in Westminster Hall, was of such vehement, such an emotional wrench that the government was obliged to act and move on that. Everything else just tends to be a talking shop, and that is pretty much it for referendums and direct democracy. I'm done. You've probably got some questions, so I look forward to hearing them. Do get them to me at the usual place, and I look forward to answering them as they come through. All the very best. Bye for now.